Good morning and welcome to the St. Norbert Distinguished Lecture Series. I'm Carrie Lewis, Executive Director of DCA, and I'm delighted that all of you are with us this morning. Before we begin, we'd like to thank our sponsors, Dahl Law Firm and Ross Estate Planning. We're also thankful for the support of our lodging partner, Apple Creek Resort, and our coffee host, Base Camp Coffee. Please give all of these folks a round of applause. We want to encourage you to come back and join us tomorrow afternoon for Door County Opry. That'll be held at 2 p.m. And next weekend, we'll be wrapping up this winter's lecture and movie series. We'll screen Letters to Jackie on Friday night, and then we'll close out the lecture series with a lecture on how national culture impacts management. Please visit our website for full descriptions. This morning, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Deirdre Egan. Dr. Egan is an assistant professor of English and director of American Studies at St. Norbert. She earned her MA and Ph.D. in English from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, specializing in 20th century American literature. Please welcome Dr. Egan.
Thanks very much. Good morning. It's nice to see you. I'm glad to see so many lifelong learners here this morning. So what I'd like to do, I figured since you are lifelong learners, you might appreciate some homework. So I've given you a very long handout. So I apologize for the length. What I figured it might be helpful to have in front of you some texts so we don't have to worry about the font size up on the screen. I'll be talking about a couple poems, especially the first two on your handout, one of which is probably familiar to many of you, which is the sonnet, which is on the Statue of Liberty by Emma Lazarus, the first poem called The New Colossus, and I'll be talking about that first. And then briefly, I'll speak about the next poem by Langston Hughes, which is The Negro Speaks of Rivers. And then I wanted to orient you to the bunch of text, which I do not expect you to read now, on pages 2 and 3. I'll be talking about a couple of women travel writers from the 1880s for a little while during my talk. And here are some quotes and dates of publication of some texts so that you have that in front of you if you're curious. A couple of times I'll be reading quotes from an artifact I'll show you, which is an advertisement from the 1880s of a map out to Yellowstone Park. And on the back of the map, which I thought at first was a real map, and then discovered was an advertisement from a Chicago map-making company, on the back of that map is a narrative that's a fictionalized narrative where a young woman who's supposed to be a British traveler on the trains in this new found nation of America is writing back to her friends back in England. And I thought some of the quotes on that map are so interesting, and you'd never be able to see them up here. So I've put some of those quotes on pages 2 and 3 so you can see them. I'll be reading them also, and I'll indicate that as I get there so that you know where we are. And then I'll also be talking about two other women, one a diarist, a woman who wrote a journal on page 3, Elizabeth Corin. She wrote a diary. She was the wife of a Norwegian pastor who came out to Decorah, Iowa, if any of you are familiar with Luther College. I used to teach there before I taught at St. Norbert. So Elizabeth Corin writes a journal of her experience, and it is not flattering, and it's kind of amusing, actually. So I gave you some quotes from that I'll be speaking from. And then also, there's a novel some of you may be familiar with. My mother actually taught this in the 50s to high school students in New York, believe it or not. It's called Giants in the Earth. I'm not sure if people are familiar with this novel. It's a kind of a pioneer epic written in the 20s by O.E. Rolvag, who wrote it first in Norwegian, but it's about American settlers. And the wife in that has some interesting things to say about the plains she's crossing, which she finds terrifying. So what I'm getting at is the structure of my talk will be a little bit the sort of the the possibilities and opportunities of travel, but also the fear and the insecurity of travel. And that's kind of the main structuring device. This is a long time, 2 hours is a long time, so I wanted to kind of keep it around a kind of simple structure in that regard, even though I'll be talking about a lot of different texts. So you don't have to read everything on this handout. I give it to you for your own interest, and if you're interested in reading along, I'll indicate where we are when we get there. And then finally, if we get there, I've prepared enough for 2 hours, but we'll see how the time goes. I've got another poem at the very end by Mark Doty, a contemporary poet, which is actually about New York, but it's about the connections we make with one another when we travel. So that's where that poem comes in. But just to give you a sense, I teach, as was indicated, I mostly teach literature. I also teach what's called American Studies, which is an interdisciplinary field to study what it is to be American. So it involves history and sociology and religious studies and even pop culture, other things. And I've been at St. Norbert College. This is my 9th year, which is shocking to me, but it's a wonderful place to teach and learn. And what I'd like to tell you a little bit about today is the idea of thinking about how as Americans we're defined by the traveling we do. Most of my lecture will not be as interactive. I've asked for the lights to be up enough that you can see your handouts, but also see the images I'm going to show you. But can I ask you, if anyone can offer up, why do we travel? What is it that excites each of you about travel? Yes?
Testing oneself, trying to view ourselves and others through other perspectives.
Absolutely, right? So this idea of testing ourselves, viewing ourselves through others' perspective, seeing others' perspective, and sort of changing our own. Education, right? In a sense, it's education. Why else do we travel? Other thoughts? Yes?
Get outside your comfort zone.
Right. Get outside your comfort zone. Push your limits a little bit. Absolutely. Other reasons? Yes? Right. See the world from somebody else's perspective. Notice how so many of your comments are about pressing beyond sort of who we are, and how much this is really about identity, sort of who we are. And I think that Americans in particular, I mean, everybody, it's sort of universal that people love traveling to a certain degree, but there's something about us that sort of presses beyond, even our history of manifest destiny, right? Pressing beyond our boundaries is really something that's interesting to us as a people. And that's something I'd like to investigate today, right? So if you could take a look at your handout for a second, there is a poem there on the first page, and it's called The New Colossus. And I'd like to read it because poetry should be read out loud. It's really a musical form, right? And this should be familiar to you. And I want you to think back to your college English days and think about what form this poem could be in, if you recognize what form it could be in. And I'll leave it at that. So, not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. All right, anyone remember the form of this poem by any chance? Yes! Do we have a former English teacher in the audience? There you go. It's a sonnet. It's a sonnet. And And the way you recognize a sonnet, it's not rocket science. It's 14 lines. Anytime you see a poem that's 14 lines, that's your first clue that it could be a sonnet in either. And there's two main strands of sonnets. There's a Shakespearean strand in the English tradition, and there's a Petrarchan strand in the Italian tradition. The Italian tradition tends to be more likely a love sonnet, although, as we know, Shakespeare wrote love sonnets as well. But Petrarch was really the kind of purveyor of the love poem. So let's think for a minute. And then there's a way to distinguish, by the way, between English and Italian. It's very simply by looking at the rhyme scheme. So when you look at this poem, you look at the last word in each line, and you see that you have a rhyme scheme, right? If you look, you have fame, land, stand, flame. Name, hand, command, frame. So when we parse out poetry, we put letters at the end of each line. Eric will know this. One of my former students is in the audience. And you put letters at the end of each line to indicate the rhyme scheme. So in this one, it would be A goes with fame, B goes with land, stand is also a B sound because it's the same sound, and flame goes back to A, right? Because it sounds like fame. So the end of these lines would be A, B, B, A. And then it goes again, name, hand, command, frame. So that's also A, B, B, A. I'm getting very technical at the beginning of the lecture. This is boring, I know, but stick with me. So you know the standard rhyme scheme for a Petrarchan sonnet begins with A, B, B, A, B, B, A. Petrarchan sonnets make a break between the first 8 lines and the next 6 lines. We call that an octave, octo 8, and a sestet for 6. Shakespearean sonnets more typically have 3 quatrains, in other words, 3 fours and a couplet. So Shakespeare's sonnets go in 3 groups and then a sort of answer at the end. The structure of a sonnet is typically problem and solution. So in Shakespeare, the problem could be, my beloved is far away from me, and the solution is, my beloved has come home, right? Very simple kind of problem-solution structure. In this poem, in the Petrarchan groupings, the first 8 lines are the problem. So if you look at that, you think to yourself, what's the problem in this poem? Now let's back up for a second. This was written in 1883 and placed on the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty in 1886. It was written by Emma Lazarus, who is a Jewish American writer, woman, probably about as powerless as they come in that period, right? You're talking about the 1880s. A Jewish woman is not going to be in any kind of position of having a very big voice in society, and yet she writes this sonnet in the Petrarchan tradition about America, right? So when you look at this, you think to yourself, it begins with a negative, doesn't it? It begins with not. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame. So you think to yourself, who's the brazen giant she's talking about? Well, she's talking about the old Colossus. This poem is the new Colossus. The old Colossus, right, and some of you are kind of, I think, remembering this probably, was the statue at the harbor at Rhodes. It was a bronze statue of Apollo that has since been in ruins, and it's one of the wonders of the world, and he stands astride the harbor in a kind of aggressive stance, right? And she even says, with conquering limbs, right? So that's the old Colossus. That's the problem. That's in the problem. The new Colossus is a mighty woman with a torch. Who's that? Of course, the Statue of Liberty, right? So what Emma Lazarus is putting before us is that we're going to bring out a new model, a new way of relating to the world, which is an idea of mild, commanding welcome, right? So she's saying in 1883, this nation is going to welcome everyone. And of course, we're coming up on one of the biggest periods of immigration in this nation's history, from the 1880s to the 1920s. So she's saying, this is what we want. We want those immigrants to come here and do well. And I want you to look at then at that sestet, which starts with the line, keep ancient lands your storied pomp. So here's your solution to the problem of the old ways of relating, which are aggressive and militaristic and all of that. She's saying, keep your storied pomp, right? Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, right? Your wretched refuse, your homeless tempest-tossed. So she's saying, they're not the problem. They're the solution to this nation. Which, if you think about it, is quite a radical statement for 1883, right? So here's one image of travel. The beloved are the homeless, and the lover is the Statue of Liberty, a welcoming woman, a mother of exiles, right? So here we have this love relationship that's on a kind of political level, right, in this poem. So what I think is interesting is to think about when travel is so self-definitive, think about immigrants and think about immigration and the kind of sense of opportunity that people sought in coming to this nation. And that there are poems out there, there's parts of our culture that says, welcome, we want you here. On the other hand, so much of that travel, right, is chosen. On the other hand, I also want us to turn our minds to a kind of travel that is constrained, right? And I'm thinking about our history of slavery in this country. And that's why I've included the next poem in front of you is called The Negro Speaks of Rivers. And this is a very famous poem by Langston Hughes, who some of you may be familiar with, I think. Langston Hughes wrote this poem in 1925. He was 18 years old at the time, which shames all of us, right? He became famous at 18, very unfair. But this poem, I think about in the context of travel. And what's fascinating is I think this poem will bring up for us the idea of slavery and the constraints and difficulties of that travel. And think about how slaves tried to reach the Ohio River, right? To cross the Ohio River to get into freedom. That was the sort of dividing line, right? In that period when people are in the Underground Railroad, and that's what they were seeking. But this poem speaks of other rivers. And it's interesting because it's in a period where Langston Hughes is part of a group of writers in the Harlem Renaissance who were really embodying black culture in ways that was really not accepted yet at this point. A number of his contemporaries, like Zora Neale Hurston, for example, was really chastised for using black English in her work. People thought she wasn't weighty enough, for example. Hughes, you'll notice this is not a sonnet, right? This does not look like 14 lines of iambic pentameter. It's not sort of constrained into that kind of a structure. This poem is what we call free verse, which is unrhymed and unmetered, right? So he's thrown out rhyming, although you'll see there's some internal rhyme, so I think you'll hear it. And he's thrown out meter. He's not got beats going on. It's not da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, which is what a sonnet sounds like. So you might think about why in 1925 a black poet would be using free verse. He was also very interested in using jazz forms and blues forms in his poetry. He kind of hoped to mimic the musical forms that were coming out of the black community. So here he focuses on rivers, and he uses, by the way, a lot of repetition in this poem. And that comes out of a kind of a black tradition of preaching, or an oral storytelling tradition out of Africa, for example, where the only way to remember a tale was by repetition, right? So he uses those things here, but he uses repetition with variation so that you get to a new place by the time the thing is repeated. So I'd like to read this poem to you also. And then we'll get to hopefully some interesting images. But I thought to set the context with some poetry that demonstrates kind of the freedom and opportunity and new identity involved in American worlds and travel, and also the kind of ways that travel can be constrained at times and challenging and difficult, but also gives you a sense of your history and who you are. So this poem, I think, does both of those things. So the Negro speaks of rivers. I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. Even reading it, I have to read that kind of lyrically, don't I? Even though there's not a rhyme scheme, but you have to read it almost like a song, because that's how he composes it, I think. So you'll notice the speaker in this poem, of course, has been to many places, right? What's fascinating to me about this poem is who is the I in this? I've known rivers. How could a person be at the Euphrates when dawns were young, and at the Congo, and at the Nile, and at the Mississippi? There's a good chance this I speaker is not one single person, that it's really meant to be a kind of universal I, right? A kind of representative of his group, right? Or her, but I suspect it's a male voice. It's not necessarily the poet himself, but it's a speaker, right? Why would Langston Hughes choose the Euphrates, the Congo, the Nile, and the Mississippi? Think of those repetitions, and then look at the repetitions of the verbs in the beginning of each of those sentences. Bathed, built, looked, heard, right? They're all action. They're all an agent doing something, right? He speaks of having a soul. Don't forget the context during slavery when we considered African Americans to be less than human, right? And the question of a soul was up for grabs. This is a poem that says, my soul is deep, right? He's making a statement about his identity, and that depth is like those deep flowing rivers. And notice the connection he makes between the rivers and the body. The rivers are like blood, right? And water as an image is often an image of life, right? Because it gives life to the surrounding land. This is a life-giving image of these various rivers and their ancient civilization, right? Don't forget the other subcontext, right? Of how civilized those Africans we were bringing over were or were not. He's saying we are, right? He's saying we're part of the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia. We were one of the earliest civilizations. We predate you, right, is a statement in this poem. At the Euphrates. Don't forget what's at the head of the Nile, Alexandria and the great libraries in Egypt, right? That was burned to the ground. But this idea of long learning, right, and education in this group of people. The Congo is one of the longest rivers in Africa, right? It's kind of known, Joseph Conrad writes about the Congo later as a kind of mysterious place, right? And the Nile, of course, and the Mississippi, and then moving to the Mississippi, one of the longest rivers in North America, but also, of course, tied to the slave trade. Langston Hughes talks about the Mississippi and hearing his grandmother say how scary it would be to be sold down the river, literally, right? Sold down the river. So he's bringing all these contexts together and reminding us of that difficult travel, that middle passage from Africa to the United States, but saying in our travels, in these moving rivers, we have life and civilization, right? So that notion that we talked about earlier about travel giving us a sense of identity, the self, exploring, right? That even in constraint, even in a sort of abominable travel, which is the slave trade, he's talking about the kind of civilization that he comes from and that he can be a part of, and that his soul is deep, like the rivers, right? So those are, again, not they're more complicated than this, but at least it gives you a sense of what I'm thinking about, that this notion of travel being expansive of the self, a new paradigm for America in our sonnet on the Statue of Liberty, and then also the way that travel brings us back to our past and helps us compare to our present and give us a sense of who we are. But I wanted to turn then to, and by the way, I'll think in terms of speaking to a little bit, about 50 minutes, and then turning it over to a break, and then I'll come back for the second part. What I'd like to show you is something I find very fun. You may not. I hope you do. A number of years ago, I did a program at the Newberry Library in Chicago, and this map that I was telling you about in the beginning, I uncovered this map in an uncatalogued map collection. And I was studying how narratives can be told over space, right? Normally we think of stories as this happened, then this happened, then this happened, which is a temporal story, right? It's chronological, right? It's over time. But I thought, how often do we actually tell stories by where we've been, right? Think about your own life stories, and you might think about the places you've been as defining kind of moments in your life, right? So I've been very interested in this idea of a spatial narrative, a tale told over places. So I got invited to do this seminar at the Newberry Library in the map collection. And Rand McNally had given over a bunch of maps to the library. And I found this one, and it was a map of Yellowstone Park. And I thought, oh, that's fascinating. I'm fascinated with this. I'm interested in how natural spaces define us and how urban spaces define us. So let me look at this. Well, it turns out it's not a real map at all. It's this advertisement. So let me show it to you. Well, first I want to actually, before I get to that, are we frozen? Hang on, there we go. Oops. Okay. Sorry, I'll get there. I think it might have gotten frozen. We'll get it. Thank you. Huh. Let's see. Maybe give it a try. Yeah, looks like it might have. This is why I brought a handout. Okay, thank you. Thanks. I think I'll start with her first, and then. So this woman is what her name is Isabella Bird, and on page 2 I've given you her name so you have it. She wrote a very famous travel narrative called A Lady's Life in the Rocky Mountains. So in the late 19th century, Victorian women began writing travel narratives. It's kind of an interesting way to think about them expanding beyond the sort of educational place that they were given. Think about it. Women were not allowed at Oxford at this stage. They weren't allowed, in general, university education. So what they did was they educated themselves, right? They read, they traveled. Now, Isabella Bird wrote A Lady's Life in the Rockies in 1873. I want to give you another context. Lewis Carroll wrote Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, which you might remember, in 1865. And then, putting that together, let me show you. Oops. Oh, come on. There we go. This is the map. And if you look at this, it looks like a real map. It has topographic elements. Yellowstone National Park. It's got other kind of actual, real things that maps include. So let me tell you a little bit about this. There's no question that women travel writers, especially the famous Isabella Bird, were highly influential in the American popular imagination during the late 19th century. Just take a look at this 1884 railroad advertisement for evidence of such popularity. At first glance, this appears to be a standard map of Yellowstone National Park, which was the first national park, having been established in 1872, just a little over a decade earlier. The map even includes a key that indicates its veracity. You can't really see this so well, but it has proposed railroads or dotted lines, and the roads are different. You know, it looks like a map. It's got a key, just like any other map. But in fact, this map was published by the Chicago-based Poole Brothers Mapmaking Company as an advertisement for the Northern Pacific Railroad route, colloquially known as the Wonderland route, for the fantastical curiosities that tourists would encounter in the new park that served as its terminus. Here's the back side of that map, folded out. This is just a photograph. So you can't see the details, but you can tell that there's a ton of writing on the back, right? Interestingly, the 1870s found the park in a period of attempting to attract elite investors and the higher-classed, moneyed tourists who would finance and stay at the hotels cropping up along the railroad and stagecoach routes. Incidentally, by the 1890s, this demographic had begun to shift as the wider tourist audience came into play, and the railroad began cutting ticket prices and allowing the free cargo of camping equipment for the more modest budget of the ordinary traveler. As part of this larger cultural shift, of course, advertisers attempted to appeal to increasingly mobile female audiences. So, in my mind, two popular concepts help explain this advertisement. First, the narrative on the reverse side of the map appears to be a travel narrative of the kind that Isabella Bird was writing at the time. Here's an image of Isabella Bird with her horse in her travels to the Rocky Mountains. The well-educated and somewhat well-to-do Englishwoman who chronicled her travel to the western landscapes clearly inspired this mapmaker advertiser. Bird's 1873 A Lady's Life in the Rocky Mountains surely stands behind this narrative that the fictional traveling Alice, also figured as a younger British traveling woman, tells in epistolary form of her own adventures in the modern and new wonderland of the U.S. West. Karen Morin, who is a literary critic who talks about women travel writers, as Karen Morin has argued, Bird's narrative figures Bird herself not only as the conquering hero whose, quote, discourse of discovery, which is another term that another critic has talked about, establishes her masculine perspective. So in other words, people have written about Isabella Bird as kind of embodying a masculine kind of conquering discourse, like I conquered the Rockies, right? They sort of label that as such. But what's interesting about Isabella Bird is that she also relied on the strength of her travel guide. They call him, by the way, Mountain Jim Nugent. There are these great images in this narrative of literally Nugent wrapping a rope around Isabella Bird's waist and yanking her up the mountain. So whether she conquered the mountain or not is debatable. In fact, I think Mountain Jim Nugent conquered her up the mountain. But anyway, her story kind of preserves the veneer, if not the reality in her case, of a kind of feminine fragility. She tells us about Mountain Jim yanking her up the mountain. In other words, Karen Morin, this literary critic, suggests that in this gesture, Isabella Bird successfully negotiates a kind of new feminine space that partakes of a masculine adventure, which would be inappropriate for a Victorian woman, right? At the same time that it assumes a kind of feminine gender expectation, so it's okay because she's feminine enough, right? She hasn't quite assumed too much of a masculine persona. The Alice of this advertisement that I'm talking about, in like manner, revels in the rugged wonders of the foreign curiosities of the park, at the same time that she appropriately faints at the first sign of the violent geyser's eruption, and she enjoys the luxury of the railroad sleeping car, right? So I'd argue that this Alice narrative on the back of the map, she kind of embodies like the sort of masculine adventuring spirit, the manifest destiny kind of spirit, but yet she embodies a kind of feminine fainting when she's supposed to, for example. So here's an image, a close-up image of when the map is folded up, what Alice looks like. And it's literally Alice's adventures in the new Wonderland, right? So this isn't the old Alice in Wonderland of Lewis Carroll. Her new Wonderland is this park that we're trying to advertise, the Yellowstone National Park. So the second context that layers into this advertisement is another allusion, one that I want to pursue a little more in depth, which is Lewis Carroll's 1865 Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. There's our brooding Lewis Carroll. And here's one of the earliest editions of his text. The young female traveling letter writer depicted in the map represents this other female traveler, the intrepid Alice, in the widely praised and highly popular children's story. Like Alice of Wonderland, who begins her narrative bored. If you remember this, I'll remind you of the story of Alice in Wonderland. She's bored and she's looking over her sister's reading that doesn't have enough images or lively conversation. She's clearly young, right? She doesn't read. And her sister's reading, and she's bored. She's looking at too many words. And by the way, Alice falls asleep, if you recall. That's the Alice in Wonderland story. And then she has these fantastical journeys, right? But she's a traveler, in a way. Remember, she goes down the rabbit hole into this whole new world. The fictionalized travel writing Alice enters into her narrative from the confines and comfort of her writing desk. There's our other Alice, right? But here's Alice in the map. This is one of the details. And look at those papers falling down like they're falling down a rabbit hole. Notice, by the way, the blue of her dress, like the grown-up Alice in Wonderland, right? So her papers tumble down just like Alice tumbled down the rabbit hole in Lewis Carroll's story. So here's that fold insert, right? The fantasy of Carroll's Wonderland becomes akin to the fantastically curious world that one enters into visiting in Yellowstone National Park. However, this Alice is obviously a much older woman than the child of Carroll's tale, and yet we cannot help but note that although younger than Isabella Bird during the writing of A Lady's Life in the Rocky Mountains, Alice here mirrors the iconic and off-cited image of the older travel writer at her desk with the ink pot at the ready. Look at that. I don't know if you can see it well enough, but this is sort of an iconic image of Isabella Bird with her ink pot ready to write at her writing desk. And there's our fictional Alice, the letter writer in the map, with her ink pot to her right elbow, and she's writing at her desk. This is kind of an iconic image of these women travel writers in this period. The consonance between these two images seems hard to overlook. Much as Bird is able to negotiate a new and perhaps even empowered space for women by embodying both the masculine and the feminine principle, so too is the young Alice of Carroll's Wonderland able to navigate her way through a strange and exotic world characterized by a sense of scale that is all out of joint. And when Alice is silenced, you remember at the end of Alice in Wonderland, if you've read it when you were 13 or whenever you read it, if you did, at the end of that narrative, she gets silenced by the queen, remember? And just as Alice is silenced at the end of her Wonderland adventure by the domineering queen, readers know that in fact, Alice has not been silenced, right? Her tale is told. She's the speaker of Alice in Wonderland. So in both cases, this new space opens up new possibilities for the female travel writers of all ages and stages, from the child to the young woman to the middle-aged woman. Indeed, the advertising mapmaker might have been thinking of both Isabella Bird and Alice in Wonderland. Regardless of whether or not the mapmaker knew of these two contexts, however, this artifact nonetheless suggests that the audience of potentially traveling women was significant enough to target pointedly with expensive color advertisements like this one. I want to suggest that the map, along with its attendant images and text, rely on these two popular texts to suggest to targeted female audiences that their fantasy of travel can become a reality. And this reality can be reached in a way that reinforces gender roles that are at once progressive and deeply conventional. Moreover, the map advertisement intimates that women increased mobility and their ability to write about such mobility amounted to new freedoms and potential for women. Karen Lawrence is another literary critic who writes about women travelers in this period. And on page 2, I've given you a quote from her book. It's called Penelope Voyages. And she talks about how women travelers kind of negotiate various difficulties in traveling. Lawrence claims, for example, that the image of Penelope, right? So Penelope in the Odysseus myth, right? So Odysseus goes out traveling and Penelope stays at home weaving her material, right? And she weaves it and unweaves it to wait for him to come home in the story of the Odyssey. But Karen Lawrence talks about Penelope as a kind of traveler in a sense. She's a travel writer. So what Lawrence talks about is how she sets up an expansion of women's sphere as an extension of their itinerary, she says. That is, they seek to both allot more and new territory to women's province and replace the static mapping of women as space. Similarly, Lawrence claims that travel writing has provided a discursive space for women who sometimes left home in order to write home, discovering new aesthetics as well as new possibilities. It seems that in this case, all three women, the two Alices and Isabella Bird, have in fact expanded their spheres in the ways that Lawrence suggests. So what I wanted to demonstrate to you, on the handout, I've noted on page 2, under letter A, that the narrative of this map sets up, basically I'd like to tell you about the map and the narrative on the back because it's so interesting in a way for how these female travelers were doing in this period. And what I think the map does in a number of ways, and you don't have the narrative in front of you, so I'm going to kind of give you a sense of it. It's not as easy to quote as a sonnet of 14 lines, for example. But I think what she does, under letter A, I talk about these kind of two separate poles. I call them dichotomies, that I think the map is trying to kind of negotiate between. She sets up fantasy and reality. She sets up a feminine and a masculine that I've already kind of talked about a little bit. She sets up a domestic and a wild sense. She sets up a sentimental way of being and a sublime way of being. By the way, sentiment was the kind of mode of talk in this period in the 1880s for women to write in 1880s, 1890s. It was appropriate for women to write sentimental novels with fainting heroines on the railroad tracks, if you get what I'm talking about, kind of the evil, man comes in tweaking his mustache, right? And the female is saved. And there's these kind of sentimental novels in that tradition. But there were also writers in this period writing kind of the sublime. The philosophers in the audience will be familiar with Kenneth Burke, and others who were talking about the way that kind of the Wordsworths of the world would see in the natural world a kind of sense of the sublime, a sense of beyond the self. And in that sublime, often a kind of terror and awe of that space. She also sets up, I think, a kind of natural and artificial world. She often goes between the railroad car, which is domesticated space, right, the sleeping car, and then the wilds of the outside, right? So the natural is the world around us, and the artificial, or the sort of cultivated, is the railroad car itself. And also a kind of private and public self that she sets up, I think, in this narrative. I've given you then on the bottom of page 2 and on to page 3 some quotes from her. And I just want to give you, I'll just read a couple of them so you get a sense of the narrative. So she says, "My dear Edith," she says, "when Mr. Carroll wrote that funny book about one of my childish dreams, I little thought the time would ever come when I should sit down to describe scenes and incidents in my actual experience, every bit as strange and bewildering. Yet so it is. So notice how she's talking about reading a book and never imagining herself in such an adventure, but here she is, right? I am here in a place which, singularly enough, they call Wonderland. Not that that title is by any means inappropriate, for the place is indeed a land of wonders. But the coincidence, at least, is somewhat remarkable, for you know what the associations of that word Wonderland are to me. She's saying, hint, hint, I'm Alice in Wonderland, all grown up. That's what the association is. That was my first big adventure, and here's my next one, going to the park, right? I mean, it's not so subtle advertising, you know, from the Poole brothers. Well, here I am, rubbing my eyes every day to be sure that I am not either in a dream or a new world. So there's a sense of fantasy, curiosity, wonder. But then in the next quote, she addresses her letter very specifically from Mammoth Hot Springs Hotel, National Park, Wyoming Territory, U.S., September 2nd, 1884, right? So this sense of reality, specific dates, specific places, a very real map. So she's always going between these two registers. I won't read all of them, but because I know you can read. But there's a number of quotes here that are really interesting. She talks about the curiosities of the park. At one point, she talks about the artifice of bridges being constructed and hotels being constructed in the park, but that everything else is untouched. So she's trying to ride both sides of it to, in a sense, our speaker is selling the park to us. If you want natural, uninterrupted space, here it is. If you want the comfort of the hotel and the railroad car, here it is, friends, right? Yes, and then she's sort of notice on the top of page 3 in your handout, she talks about the sentimental, flowery language that she's keeping in check. She looks at the first canyon in the Yellowstone River and she says, "It is a grand scene, but I'm mindful that I must not indulge in too much flowery language, or my slender stock of adjectives will be exhausted before I can come to the grandest part." Right? So she's saying, well, I'm sort of writing like those sentimental writers that Nathaniel Hawthorne thought were bunk. I'm sort of writing like them, but I'm also a very serious travel writer, and I will tell you of my experience, right? So, and I'll show you a few of these images now, just so you can see them and where they come from. So there's Alice. That's an insert. Think how much she looks like Isabella Bird. It's a very similar style of dress, mode, all of that. Notice, I don't know if you can see, but she's got her binoculars, her artifice, her ability to see that landscape kind of scientifically slung across her side. This is the back side of the map, and it says Northern Pacific Railroad, the Wonderland route to the Pacific coast. There's a round insert there, if you can see that, and there's a boat and a huge mountain. Is a little bit closer in to see that. There's a person in a little boat there. There's a railroad car jumping out at us actively. There's a pen and paper, right? That image in that circle is straight out of William Wordsworth. It's straight out of the image of the sublime, where the human individual in a natural landscape is kind of overcome with a sense of his or her smallness in the face of giant natural beauty, right? And sort of has a redefinition of self as a result. And that sounds very lofty, doesn't it? But we all know of moments in natural landscapes when we've felt that sense of awe and beauty and sense of smallness in the face of this kind of beauty, right? That's the sense of the sublime that I think she's trying to capture in a few moments, and there's an image of it that looks straight out of those writers. There she is with her binoculars, and look how much she blends into her landscape. So while she's removed from her landscape with her binoculars, scientifically exploring the place, she's also completely embedded in that landscape. The blues of her dress, the browns of the rocky outcropping, right? So she's naturally kind of meant to be there. She makes sense in this landscape. She's the same colors as that landscape. And there she is. You can see some of those same colors repeated. Some of this is because of the expense of the advertising that keeps some of the same color schemes, of course. But there's somebody, hunting in this, that's part of the map. Here's her, you can see her kind of matching, her papers matching the sheep on the outcropping there. This notion of tumbling down into a new world, being part of that, just like Alice in Wonderland. And then remember I spoke of the reality, right? She's in Mammoth Hot Springs, this very specific place. The back of the map literally ends with a train schedule from St. Paul, Minnesota out to the park. So all of a sudden on the back of the map you have reality. You have this fantasy you could take, but then you have the reality sitting right in front of you of when exactly you could take the train to get out there. I'm just about at time for us to have a break. Then I just want to preview for you. So this section has talked about how travelers, and in particular a woman traveler, because I think the idea of self-definition of women in the 1880s was a really interesting question, how that offered opportunities for them to kind of become an identity, right, or to embody an identity. This pair that looks so happy, I love images from this period, they crack me up. It's just such a different convention. We smile at everything, and I love these pictures. But this is Elizabeth Koren and Wilhelm Koren. He was the Norwegian pastor sent to Decorah, Iowa, and she had to go along as the wife. And I have some excerpts from her journals to speak about her experience. So that was the sort of opportunity moment that I've begun with. And after the break, I'll go to the moment which is the sort of travel as constraint, kind of, and how we negotiate that. So maybe we'll take a break, and then, by the way, I'll leave some time at the end for questions and that kind of thing as well. I have less material for the second half, so we have time for questions. Okay, thank you. Enjoy some coffee. I think we'll get started. We're more than halfway there, which is good. So as I mentioned, what I'd like to do in this part is talk a little bit about this journal writer, this diary writer, Elizabeth Corrin. And then I'll talk about this novel. And as you wouldn't have the novel in front of you, I have a few quotes on your handout so that you get a sense of what I'm referring to. As I said, the novel is Giants in the Earth. So notice that I'm putting together a nonfiction writer, right, a diarist, somebody who's writing about real lived experience, historical experience. In fact, I was just telling someone in the audience, in this journal that I learned about when I taught at Luther College for a couple of years, and my husband's great-great-grandfather's farm was one of the first homesteads in Winneshiek County. And in this journal, she talks about going to his house and having the Christmas beer with him. And so it's a great connection. So my husband said, that's my great-great-grandfather. So it's a fun, nice connection. So I'll talk about this in this section a little bit about some constraining travel, right? Some travel that is challenging to individuals. And then if we have a moment, we'll look at the contemporary poem I brought with me, and then we'll head into some questions, okay? So while Karen Lawrence, who is the person I quoted who wrote that Penelope Voyages, excuse me, about the expansion, about the expansion of women's spheres. While Karen Lawrence and others have argued ably that travel writing allowed women like Isabella Bird new freedom and flexibility within the typically restrictive and circumscribed gender norms of the Victorian world, however, I'm still left wondering about their position in that society. All three female figures that we've examined thus far, travel writer Isabella Bird, Alice of Carroll's narrative, and Alice in the advertising map, are single, unattached to strong males in any form of socially sanctioned institution like marriage. The young Alice is a child even. All three come from the upper class, or at the very least, upper middle or leisure class. All three choose their travel adventures. For leisure in the case of Alice in the map advertisement, for health reasons in Bird's case, she talked about going out west for health reasons, and to escape boredom in the case of the child Alice. These three are free already, in a sense, to renovate their position in society given their relative lack of entrenchment in the cultural institutions that can bind and define. But what happens when women are constrained by circumstances, such as a commitment to a marriage in which one partner needs to relocate for employment, or in which immigration seems the only viable option for the family's survival? How do such women articulate their travel in these circumstances? And how much cultural work can this writing do for women's roles? Once again, I want to turn to Karen Lawrence's understanding of traveling women in the sense that she asserts her interest in, quote, the way both fictional and non-fictional travel engages in contradictions foregrounded in travel and travel writing, between intention and surprise, authority and adjustment, calculation and risk, and the role of representation of the foreign. What I mean by this is that just because Lawrence asserts a kind of optimism for women's increased freedom in travel writing, she appreciates that the process is not so clear-cut. Lawrence knows that in travel literature, in fact, one expresses and represses what she calls fundamental anxieties. The anxiety that underscores much of women's travel writing, I would like to suggest, is patently spatial in nature. Turning to a non-fictional and fictional rendering of two Norwegian women travelers to the Midwestern United States and to their written responses to such travel, I think we can learn much about the complexity of their specific experiences and positions. Although Isabella Bird's rendering of the U.S. West was highly inspiring to women travelers, so much so that the railroad advertisements from the 1880s styled themselves on her A Lady's Life in the Rocky Mountains in order to appeal to women who would visit the newly established national parks, many women found that such locations did not always offer the freedom they sought in such landscapes. These vast expanses of unsettled space also ironically worked to enclose some women travelers. Therefore, let us turn to the experiences of diarist Elizabeth Corin and fictionally rendered immigrant traveler Berit Hansa as examples of women who were compelled to travel and who wrote about their experiences in significantly less complimentary language. Born to a well-established Norwegian family, the daughter of a school principal and a granddaughter of a well-known Norwegian woman writer, Elizabeth Heising married Ulrich Wilhelm Corin in 1853. In that same year, they left his post as a Lutheran minister in Lutheran minister in Northeast Iowa. Elizabeth Corin kept a diary in her native language of their voyage and early experiences in America, covering from 1853 until 1855. Corin was only 21 years old when she emigrated to America, speaking very little English, and even in Norway, having very little contact with the Norwegian farming communities with whom she would be enmeshed once she arrived in Iowa. This is something that's interesting to me to think about as immigrant experiences go. We know that immigrants settle close to like-minded folk, right? Or at least close to people who are from a similar place where they're from. But what we forget about is the class distinctions. So Elizabeth Corin was really a part of a kind of upper class, but she settled near farming people who were not of her class. So her experience was very alien in a lot of ways, even amongst the Norwegians with whom she was relating. They arrived just before Christmas in 1853 and spent the first 3 months living with the Eggy family in a tiny cabin. See it? And there she is. That's the cabin. So this is, I have some images here from, if you ever get the chance to go to Decorah, Iowa, and a few of you might have been there before, there's a wonderful Norwegian-American museum there. In fact, it's the largest museum dedicated to a single ethnicity in the United States. And it's the Vesterheim Museum. And so they have a museum structure, which is really interesting about Norwegian immigration. But they also have several outbuildings that you can walk inside and look around in. So I took some photographs. So Elizabeth Corin actually stayed in this little cabin when she first arrived with her husband and with the Eggy family, which is another family there. Yes? Oh, that's a great question. Hang on. I have it in my notes, and I can tell you it was 14 feet by 16 feet. They were there for a couple of months with this other family. Yes. And I'll show you some images of the type. I don't have the exact house she lived in Norway, but I'll show you the distinction so you understand where her general dis-ease or unease comes from. So in the pattern of many immigrants, the Corins stayed with 2 other families until they finally moved into the log parsonage on their own in October of 1854. So think of that. That's almost a full year where they were living with other families in tiny cabins. Corin's diary is marked by a general unhappiness and surprise at the friendliness of the new neighbors, almost all Norwegian immigrants, surrounding them in this new country. But more importantly, her travel narrative is peppered with commentary on the spatial constraints of the new world that is crowded beyond her comfort level. Time and again, Corin notes the stuffy homes and crowded conditions that force her into closer contact with others than she would like. Especially early on in her narrative, Corin only finds solace in looking to the outdoor world to examine. In a kind of amateur naturalist fashion, the trees, shrubs, and birds of this new landscape, often comparing them unfavorably to her home country. From the close quarters on the ship about which she complains, to the restaurant she enjoys on the stopover in New York, Corin's travel consistently favors open space. The ship is full of, and I think I've given you a quote here. On page 3, if you're interested, I have a few quotes from her diary. So if you're interested, they're there for you. In the middle of the page, Elizabeth Corin, the diary of Elizabeth Corin. She said that the ship is full of, quote, a throng of steerage people. As you can, I think you can hear the tone in that one. A throng of steerage people. But once in New York, she exclaims that Taylor's restaurant on Broadway is splendid, right? Due to the fact that it is extremely large with a balcony over half of it. Of immigrant New Yorkers and their living conditions, she notes, in this cross between a kitchen and a living room, so they were staying with a family in New York on the way out to the plains, but she notes, in this cross between a kitchen and a living room, the family is usually found. They live in cramped quarters, as do most people here. She goes on to explain that even the food items give a sense of crowded space. On the wall hang great bundles of onions and dried lemon peel. Once in Iowa, little changes in the way of available space. Such close quarters have a profound effect on Corin's perspective. She describes a false sense of nature to the world surrounding her, undoubtedly affected by her spatial situation. She says, "It always makes me sad when I hear that in America the birds do not sing and the flowers have no fragrance." Remember, she's 21, right? You know, she's a young woman. I mean, and to her, this is very difficult, right? I feel as if something of the finest were lacking, as if no real joy could be felt in nature. And so my thoughts turn with melancholy to the beautiful summer evenings at home, right? Clearly a homesick young woman, but interesting that she reads this sadness onto the spaces around her, which we can understand, right? Interestingly, as the Corins progress through various homes in which they stay until finally they experience roomier surroundings, she revises this sentiment, claiming, "Rumor is slanderous in what it says about the fragrance of flowers in America. Many are fragrant." Right? So think of that. Rumor is slanderous. She herself had made that rumor just pages before in her same diary. But, you know, again, it's her perspective. She goes on to note, as to the songbirds, rumor is perhaps more truthful, although there are said to be many that sing beautifully, but most of the time we must be content with the chirping. Note here the shift in perspective brought on by a new spatial relationship. Once Corin feels she has breathing room, she begins to become more optimistic about this landscape. She does eventually gain a more open perspective and therefore adapt more successfully to her new place. The point here, however, is that her sense of the new place in which she is grounded is originally and generally filtered through her sense of feeling too enclosed, too crowded, too cramped. So let me show you a few more images from the Vesterheim Norwegian American Museum in Decorah. So this Decorah is the town outside which the Corins settled. So they settled out in the countryside. So here's the Eggy cabin. That was 14 by 16 feet. Oops, wrong direction, sorry. Ooh, la la la. Technology not being my strong suit. There we go. In here, so this is the bed that she describes having to dress behind that curtain. And she's very frustrated that she hears the men coming in and she has to pull the curtain close near her. You can see there's another bed right backed up to it, right? So those two beds are end to end in the cabin. So there's another family there, plus she and her husband. There's the tiny cook stove in the corner. And there's right under a staircase is where they held their, cookery and that kind of thing. This, however, is an image of, now this is not the exact one, this is the kind of house she would have left in Norway. Notice the higher level of detail. It's painted red, little nice detail on the outside, much larger. I forget how big this one is. Look at the first room you come into has much more space, has a spinning wheel, right? They have more luxury, more things. There's the cook stove, but also a fireplace with it. Notice the level of detail. This is a carved dresser, and there's the picture of the Corins there. But more leisure time to do that kind of decoration, of course, right? And here's the immigrant chest that you may have these in your families, right? Many, many, many immigrants brought over a chest like this and put all of their belongings in that. So whatever could fit in that is what came with them, right? So, and this chest gives me the opportunity to tell you about another counterpoint experience, and this time a fictional one. So as a counterpoint to the diary writer Elizabeth Corin's experience of enclosed space, I'd like now to turn to another woman traveler, the fictional Norwegian immigrant Berit Hansa, in O.E. Rollvag's pioneer epic novel of the Plains country set during the 1870s called Giants in the Earth. By the way, a terrific novel if you get the chance to read it. Rollvag composed Giants in Norwegian, publishing it in Norway in 2 parts in 1924 and 1925. He later translated it with Lincoln Colcord, publishing the full text in English in 1927. The novel forms part of a trilogy, Giants in the Earth in 1927, Pater Victorious about their son in 1928, and Their Father's God in 1931, about the Hansa family, its westward movement and settlement at Spring Creek, South Dakota Territory, with the action of the first novel taking place from 1873 to 1881. The novel opens with what appears to be an exuberantly optimistic impression of the plains, which is immediately mitigated by a subtle undercurrent of dread. The first lines read, and I think I might have given you that quote. No, I haven't given you this one. The first lines of the novel read, "Bright clear sky over a plain so wide that the rim of heavens cut down on it around the entire horizon. Bright clear sky, today, tomorrow, and for all time to come." This opening description of the landscape, punctuated by too many exclamation points, an insistent repetition of an optimistic brightness, comes to parallel Berit Hansa's husband's, Per Hansa's, attitude toward the immigrant adventure placed before him. That's very much clearly out of Per Hansa's experience. He's very optimistic about their opportunity here. Berit's perspective, on the other hand, mirrors a different sense of place. As the Hansa family's wagon caravan progresses through the landscape, searching for the Norwegian friends who they have lost at the opening of the novel, the landscape becomes personified as a surprisingly powerful force, a force that Berit comes to recognize and dread while Per battles against it. Rollvag writes, "The track it left behind the wagon train, the track it left behind was like the wake of a boat, except that instead of widening out astern, it closed in again. The prairie grass," and he quotes, "bends resiliently under the trampling feet. It did not break, but it complained aloud every time." Listen to the personification that the grass itself is complaining about the wagon train coming through. In both of these descriptions, we see the subtle power, supremacy, and resiliency of the landscape that Per will attempt to conquer, so to speak, through breaking sod, building a house, planting crops. Throughout the novel, Per's conquering and competitive mentality, his ability to face the challenges of open space, has him adapting to this new landscape apparently much better than Berit. Although you should read the novel. I'll leave it at that. I'm just going to say that. Apparently better than Berit. Berit, on the other hand, recognizes the power of the place laid out so subtly in this opening description. She consistently fears the open spaces of the prairie and longs for her homeland in a series of images of enclosure as safety, eventually culminating in a fit of madness where she climbs into the family's immigrant chest, on which is carved the history of her family in Norway. She literally, at one point, can't stand the landscape so much, she literally climbs into the chest. And she needs like enclosure. Not only is this moment a representation of protection in enclosed space and a return to her roots, it is also a kind of death scene with the chest, or in Norwegian, and please forgive my pronunciation, or kistja, standing in for coffin. By the way, the word in Norwegian is the same, coffin and chest, kistja. So in the original Norwegian, the immigrant chest can be read as either a chest or a coffin. And she clearly kind of relates to that concept. Standing in for a coffin and the release from striving that death would offer Berit. This scene, while strange, is prepared for throughout the novel. Berit expresses a strong sense of foreboding about the vastness of the landscape very early on in the narrative. When they first arrive at the settlement, finally having been reunited with their fellow travelers, she observes the little outpost on the open plain. And I've given you this quote on the bottom of page 3. She says, "Was this the place? Here? Could it be possible?" She concludes that here something was about to go wrong and exclaims, "Why, there isn't even a thing that one can hide behind." Hardly an optimistic take on the space itself. Instead of understanding the openness as possibility, Barrett longs for the solidity and safety of enclosure. Even as the family builds their house, this sense persists for Barrett. Instead of recognizing comfort in the house, she retreats further within, literally and metaphorically, eventually drawing the curtains permanently against the open landscape. She literally pulls the curtains closed. She can't look at the open landscape. She becomes so disconnected from the community in her withdrawal that the others stop visiting the Hansa house, thinking, "There's something queer about the woman in that place. She said so little. At times people felt they were unwelcome there." For immigrants attempting to survive on rough terrain and against great challenges from the natural world, such disconnection is devastating. Even in the symbolically rich and optimistic birth of her firstborn son in America on Christmas Day, remember this is a novel, right? So the firstborn is born on Christmas. And by the way, interestingly, Barrett is highly, highly religious. Really wonderful, rich, kind of biblical allusions in this text. So even what could be a very optimistic birth of her son, Barrett is convinced of her own death. As she struggles through labor, she asks Pear to lay out her dead body in the immigrant chest as a coffin. Now, the reality, of course, in this world is that many women did die in childbirth, but she wants to be laid out in that chest. Her thoughts return to the churchyard back in Norway, quote, enclosed by a massive stone wall that she describes as reliable. She thinks of, quote, how it would have been so pleasant to lie down there. It's important to note here the connection between safety, comfort, and pleasure, which are all tied to her homeland and enclosed space, both spaces entirely opposite from her spatial experience of the plains. Despite the fact that Pear has apparently adapted more successfully to this open landscape, however, oh, I'm gonna give it away. Should I spoil it? Maybe I shouldn't. So he apparently has adapted better, but in the end of the first volume, the first part of the trilogy, he dies in a snowstorm sitting on a haystack, having skied out for help. But he dies sitting out in the weather. So he seems to be the very successful, sort of competitive American, and in fact, nature overcomes him. Barrett, who respects and fears the landscape, survives throughout the trilogy, which is kind of interesting. And while Barrett's almost neurotic fears of what she perceives to be, she calls it a monstrous landscape, interrupt her ability to adapt to this world, Rolvag has her survive throughout the trilogy. She eventually takes on more balanced roles in the community. The point here is that Barrett has, in fact, read the landscape well, in a sense, through her caution. While indeed many women travelers, such as Isabella Bird, Lewis Carroll's Alice of Wonderland, and Alice in the map we have examined, did in fact experience the freedom of their new landscapes, this is not the whole story. Elizabeth Corrin's 1853 to 1855 diary details the travails of following her pastor husband from Norway to his new post in Northeast Iowa. Corrin critiques the claustrophobic lives of immigrants in a narrative effort to move beyond the strictures of this new land, all the while seeking the natural world as a kind of breath of fresh air that she needs. Berit Hansa, wife of the larger-than-life pioneer Per Hansa in O.E. Rolvag's Giants in the Earth, recoils in fear and madness at the stretches of grassland confronting her. Her fears result from open space rather than from Corrin's oppositional anxiety about enclosed space. In this 1920s modernist epic of 19th century Norwegian immigrants settling the Dakota Territory, Barrett finds hardship and a lack of connection instead of the promise of community. She seeks solace in her enclosed immigrant trunk, a symbolic and womb-like homeland that represents comfort in the midst of proliferating possibility. Taken together, these narratives suggest the paradoxical double bind of many traveling women. Bound by others' wills, their travel at times was characterized by stifling confinement and terrifying expanse. But I don't want to leave it there, because that would be highly negative. So what I want to do is point out that as we began this morning's discussion, we talked about sort of the possibilities and limitations of travel and how it defines us, right, in so many ways as a group of people. And I'll just point out to you, because I'd like to leave some time for discussion. On the last page of your handout, I've given you a contemporary poet, Mark Doty. Doty, the poem called Broadway that appears in a volume called My Alexandria. It's written in 1993. Doty teaches at a college in upstate New York now. He's still writing. I've heard him read. He's wonderful. This poem is interesting. It's about Broadway. But what's so fascinating to me is that despite it looking like it's about a static place of New York, it's also about travel. In the middle of the poem, there's a moment where we're on a subway car and there's a homeless man named Ezekiel. Those of you who have any religious background, think of the prophet Ezekiel. Ezekiel tells a poem on the subway car. And then later, the speaker of the poem is standing on the street and reaches across his car to a homeless woman named Carlotta who was asking for money, and he holds her hand. And he says, I don't know why I did it. She was just asking for change. And what's interesting is that all of these images of travel on the sidewalk, on the subway car, demonstrate what he's doing, and he does this in a lot of his work, about the connection with the other, right? The other might be homeless. The other might be disenfranchised in some way. The other might be a different culture. But in this poem, I think it's just this lovely image of the ways in which travel encourages us to connection with ourselves, knowing ourselves better, but also with others in a way that often surprises us in the unexpected kind of beautiful, lyrical moments, right? So I'll end by just reading this poem for you. Broadway. Under Grand Central's tattered vault, maybe a half-dozen electric stars still lit, one saxophone blew, and a sheer black scrim billowed over some minor constellation under repair. Then, on Broadway, red wings in a storefront tableau, lustrous, the live macaws preening, beaks opening and closing like those animated knives that unfold all night in jewelers' windows. For sale, glass eyes burned outward toward the rain. The birds lined up like endless flowers and cheap gems, the makeshift tables of secondhand magazines, and shoes the hawker's eye while they shelter in the doorways of banks. So many pockets and paper cups, and hands reeled over the weight of that glittered pavement. And at 103rd, a woman reached to me across the wet roof of a stranger's car and said, "I'm Carlotta, I'm hungry." She was only asking for change, so I don't know why I took her hand. The rooftops were glowing above us, enormous, crystalline, a second city lit from within. That night, a man on the downtown local stood up and said, "My name is Ezekiel. I am a poet, and my poem this evening is called Fall." He stood up straight to recite, a child reminded of his posture by the gravity of his text, his hands hidden in the pockets of his coat. "Love is protected," he said, "the way leaves are packed in snow, the rubies of fall. God is protecting the jewel of love for us." He didn't ask for anything, but I gave him all the change left in my pocket. The man beside me, impulsive, moved, gave Ezekiel his watch. It wasn't an expensive watch. I don't know if it worked, but the poet started, then walked away, as if so much good fortune must be hurried away from before anyone realizes it's a mistake. Carlotta, her stocking cap glazed like feathers in the rain, under the radiant towers, the floodlit ramparts, must have wondered at my impulse to touch her, which was like touching myself, the way your own hand feels when you hold it because you want to feel contained. She said, "You get home safe now, you hear?" In the same way, Ezekiel turned back to the benevolent stranger. "I will write a poem for you tomorrow," he said. "The poem I will write will go like this: Our ancestors are replenishing the jewel of love for us." So what I wanted to note there at the end is notice how the landscape in the midst of this travel and the connection that happens between very different people changes. It's like a new Jerusalem. The city is glowing. And it's probably a part of the city that's not that wealthy, right? We've got homeless people asking for change. But all of a sudden, the city is crystalline and it's floodlit ramparts, right? So it's almost like in that travel and in that connection with someone who's very different from you, the whole world shifts. So that's about all I have for you today. So thank you. I wondered, oh, thank you. So do we have any questions or thoughts or anything like that? And it looks like we have a microphone going around as well, so.
Were you suggesting that Isabel Bird, is that the right name?
Yeah.
Was the author of the material on the Alice map?
No. Good question. What I was trying to do was link what was very popular at that time, which was Isabella Bird's narratives, with what these advertisers were picking up on and noticing that if they're advertising it, it must be something that people are really reading and looking at. So I don't think she did. What I would love to find out, and this is part of what I need to research, is who actually wrote the text. Because I'm guessing that advertisers in 1884 are probably male, so it's probably a male writer, I'm guessing, in Chicago. I'm guessing it's some guy who works in the Poole Brothers advertising office, to be honest. But picking up on what he knew was popular among women at that time, so they could target them as potential. Does that answer your question? Thank you. Other thoughts? Yes.
Well, I was struck by the first poem about the Statue of Liberty.
Yeah.
And when you say, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses," and now we seem to be asking for people with Ph.D.s and special skills.
Right.
And those are the only ones welcome.
Yes.
And how they're, and then the other thing is, I happened to see, I can't remember if it was on PBS or what, but how you can enjoy different cultures without leaving the comfort of your own place. And they, which I've been to, there's a place in Florida that has a large Greek community, and then they were also talking about Canada. And
Right.
I didn't see what that was, but I'm guessing you can experience France and England without going there.
Right.
But I'm just wondering what you think about the current American thoughts on
immigration. Right.
immigration and on experiencing other cultures and other peoples.
Well, that's a great discussion point and question. I think what's so interesting to me is that this sonnet literally is on the Statue of Liberty. So, and this was such, I think for its period, such a kind of radically open perspective. And it was coming up on that period, the 1880s to 1920s period of immigration that was so high. By 1924, we really shut down the gates. We had a series of immigration restrictions. We even had something called the Chinese Exclusion Act that some of you might be familiar with. After the gold rush, we actually wrote legislation to say that the Chinese were blocked, absolutely blocked to come here. And the only way some slipped through eventually was because the fire in San Francisco had burned records, so they would claim that they were related to somebody and created papers. So by the 1920s, we really started clamping down and had this period of kind of nationalist fervor that said that we were what they called it a nativist movement by the 20s. And it's debatable about where we stand now, whether we're in another period of nativism. It's interesting to think about where we've come, because there are lots of ways in which throughout our history we've found ways to exclude people by literacy tests and that kind of thing. But you're right, we encourage now the Ph.D.s, not the homeless tempest tossed sometimes. But it's something to think about, because this really was a moment where we were self-defining and against the sort of the Greek and Roman past, which is part of our classical background. But here she's saying we're not Apollo, we don't want to keep people out, but we haven't always lived up to that, I guess. You know, you're right. Others? Yeah.
If you could just wait for the mic to get to you so we can hear it back there.
A problem with travel and expanding of mind and tightening the tie that binds, and that now is a new wrinkle of terrorism and religious wars and such. We've never had that I can think of through history.
That's a good point.
Where the constraints have been so bad, and how threatening that is
Right.
to the future.
Right, and to think about where do we feel free to travel, right? And who do we want coming here? So you're right, it really isn't a wrinkle in the question of, I mean, I think it's a silly connection in a sense, but I think back to Berit Hansa and her sense of security, right? That question of security and enclosure is part of this whole issue of travel now. Yeah, good point.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Egan, for joining us this morning. Thanks to all of you for being here. Hope to see you back here next Saturday morning, and have a safe drive back to St. Norbert.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you for having me.